Somewhere on the black sand of Iwo Jima, a young Marine is lying flat behind a radio, and he is saying words into it that no one on the other side can understand. Not the enemy listening in, not the cryptographers in Tokyo who had already cracked a number of the codes the Americans used. To them it sounds like an animal, or a garble, or a machine coming apart. It is none of those things. It is a language, and it is carrying the exact position of every gun about to open fire. The strangest part is this. The boy speaking it had spent his childhood being punished for those same sounds. By the end of the Second World War, Japan had cracked or worn down a number of American codes. Some army traffic, some field ciphers, the careless talk of tired men on open channels. There was one they never broke. Not once. Not at Guadalcanal, not at Saipan, not on the worst days of Iwo Jima. After the war, Japan's own chief of intelligence admitted it plainly. The code built out of the Navajo language was the one wall his people could never get through. That code was not built by a laboratory. It was built by around 400 young men from the Navajo Nation, most of them Marines, many of them still teenagers. And here is the thing this country spent decades not saying out loud. The language they used to save thousands of American lives was the same language the United States government had been trying to beat out of Navajo children for 2 generations. This is the story of those men, what they made, what it cost them, and how their own country asked them to keep quiet about it until most of them were gone. To understand the code, you have to start in a schoolroom, years before the war. For decades, the policy of the United States toward Native children was written down and clear. Take the child away from the family, send him to a government or church boarding school, often hundreds of miles from home, and there, strip the Navajo out of him. There was even a slogan for it. An Army officer named Richard Pratt, who founded the first big off-reservation school, put the whole philosophy into 6 words. "Kill the Indian," he said, "and save the man." His school became the model for more than 300 others across the country. When a Navajo boy arrived, they took his clothes and gave him a uniform. They cut his hair. They gave him a new name in English, and they told him the language in his mouth was finished. The children were forbidden to speak their own language, not discouraged. Forbidden. A boy caught speaking Navajo, the only words he had ever known, might be beaten for it. A common punishment was to have his mouth washed out with soap, as if the language itself were something filthy that had to be scrubbed away. Chester Nez went into one of those schools when he was 8 years old. He would later help invent the code. As a small child, he was taught that the sounds in his own mouth were a thing to be ashamed of. Think about what that does to a boy. You are told, by teachers, by the whole weight of a government, that the first language you ever loved is wrong, that to be acceptable, you have to lose it. Most of these children were not being trained to be soldiers. They were being trained to disappear into someone else's idea of America. And yet the language survived. It survived in the summers back home, in grandparents who never stopped speaking it, in the plain, stubborn fact that you cannot reach into a child and delete the first words he ever heard. Navajo is extraordinarily hard for an outsider. For most of its history it was never written down. Its grammar is intricate, its tones change the meaning of a word, its sounds do not sit anywhere near English. In the entire world, only a small number of people outside the nation had ever learned it, mostly missionaries and scholars who had lived on the reservation. Nobody in 1941 thought of that as an asset. In the eyes of the government, it was a problem they were still trying to solve. One man looked at the same language and saw the opposite. His name was Philip Johnston. He was not Navajo. He was the son of missionaries, and he had grown up on the reservation, one of that handful of outsiders who actually spoke the language. Early in 1942, with the Pacific going badly and American codes falling one after another, Johnston walked into the Marine Corps with an idea that sounded almost too simple. Use Navajo. Not written down, just spoken, man to man, over the radio. A language so rare, so hard, so completely outside the enemy's experience that hearing it would tell them nothing. To prove it, Johnston set up a demonstration. In late February 1942 at Camp Elliott near San Diego, 2 Navajo men were handed a typical military field order and put in a separate room. They translated it into Navajo, sent it by voice to their partners several rooms away, and those men turned it back into clean, correct English on the other end. The officers watching had never seen anything like it. The commander asked headquarters in Washington to authorize the immediate recruitment of 200 Navajo Marines. Washington cut that to a pilot group. And so, in May 1942, the first 29 young Navajo men arrived at the recruit depot in San Diego. History remembers them now as the original 29. Most of them were very young, boys off the reservation who had rarely, if ever, left it. Some of them barely old enough for the uniform. They went through 7 weeks of boot camp like any other Marines. Then they were handed a job no training manual existed for. Build a code. Build it out of your own language. And build it strong enough that men's lives can ride on it. Think about the irony sitting in that room. The government had spent years and real cruelty trying to take this language away from these exact men. Now the Marine Corps was locking them in a room and asking them to save it, to sharpen it, to turn it into a weapon. They did not just translate English into Navajo. That would have been breakable. A fluent speaker could have pulled it apart. Instead, they built a code on top of the language, a second secret hidden inside the first. They started with the alphabet. Each letter of English got a Navajo word. A was Wolachi, the word for ant. E was Dze, the word for elk. Spell a word out letter by letter and, to anyone listening, you were just naming animals and objects with no pattern at all. Then they built a vocabulary for war. Hundreds of terms the language had never needed. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish. A dive bomber became genie, chicken hawk. A fighter plane was Dahetihi, hummingbird. When there was no word for a thing that killed men, they reached into the desert and the sky and found one. They began with 211 terms. By the end of the war, the code had grown past 400. And here is the part that still stops me. None of it could be written down where it counted. The men had to carry the entire code in their heads. Recruits were not allowed to take notes. There were training booklets, but those booklets never went to the front because a captured code book is a broken code. So a 19-year-old had to memorize 400 terms plus the whole alphabet, cold, and be able to fire them off under machine gun fire without a single mistake. The code lived in the minds of the men who carried it and nowhere else on Earth. They had built the thing. Now they had to prove, in combat, that it actually worked. And the first people who needed convincing were their own side. If a man in your own family carried something like this, a job in the war he came home and never explained, stay with me to the end. There is a place near the end of this story for his name, and I mean that literally. But first, the day the code went to war. In August 1942, the trained code talkers shipped to Guadalcanal, the first brutal American offensive of the Pacific. That is where the code stopped being a demonstration and became a matter of survival. The early tests, back in training, had almost been comic. Skeptical officers set the Navajo against the fastest coding machines the Marines had. A 3-line message that took a machine around 30 minutes to encode, send, and decode the code talkers could do by voice in about 20 seconds. 20 seconds against 30 minutes, and the Navajo version came out accurate. Out in the islands, the code did something no machine could. It moved at the speed of a man talking, and it could not be read by the men trying hardest to read it. Picture how it actually worked. A message comes down to a code talker in plain English. Enemy positions, map coordinates, an order to shift a company or bring down artillery. He does not write it in code. He speaks it straight into the handset in Navajo, using the words the original 29 had built in that room. Miles away, another Navajo Marine hears it, and in his head, in seconds, it becomes English again, and he passes it to his officer. No machine, no codebook to capture. Two young men and a language doing something no cipher device in either army could match. And they did it in the worst places on earth to do it. Flat on the ground with rounds coming in, ears ringing, bone tired. One wrong word could drop shells on your own Marines. They did not say the wrong word. Island after island, under fire, they got it right. The Japanese were not amateurs about signals. They had skilled cryptographers. They had broken codes that took other nations years to build. When they first heard Navajo on the radio, they recorded it, studied it, and ran it past every expert they had. They got nothing. No pattern, no way in. It did not behave like any code they knew, because underneath it was not a machine at all. It was a living language almost no outsider had ever learned, wrapped around a second code that even a native speaker could not read without training. That last part matters more than anything else, because the enemy did the obvious thing. If the code is Navajo, they thought, then find a Navajo and make him talk. They already had one. His name was Joe Kiayumia. He was Navajo, and he was a soldier, but he was not a code talker. He had gone to war with a New Mexico artillery unit, and he was captured when the Philippines fell in 1942. Kiayumia survived the Bataan Death March, one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War. Then it got worse for him, in a way it did not for the other prisoners. His captors looked at his face and decided he was Japanese-American, a traitor in an American uniform. They beat him for months for a crime he had not committed, the crime of being born the wrong shape for their assumptions. Only slowly did they accept that he was Navajo, and that was when someone in the Japanese command realized what they were holding. They had been failing to break that maddening radio language. Now they had a man who spoke Navajo, so they brought him in and ordered him to translate it. He couldn't. He listened to the intercepts, his own language coming out of the speaker, and it meant nothing. Ironfish, chicken hawk, a string of animals and objects that made no sense to a man who had not sat in that room in 1942 and built the second secret. He understood every Navajo word, and he could not understand a single message. They did not believe him. So they tortured him for an answer he did not have. A Navajo man, beaten by the enemy to break a Navajo code, and he could not do it, because his own country's Marines had built it better than that. Joe Kiayumia lived through the rest of the war as a prisoner. He was being held in Nagasaki when the second atomic bomb fell, and he survived that too, reportedly shielded by the concrete walls of his cell. He came home to a country that had spent his childhood trying to erase the very language that had just protected its deepest secret from him. Here is the cruelest turn of all. The code talkers were not always safe among their own side either. Their own uniform did not always protect them. A code talker named William McCabe was waiting on a beach at Guadalcanal for his ship when an American soldier stopped him, looked at his face and said, "I think you are a Jap." The man was ready to shoot him. After that, another Marine was assigned to stay at McCabe's side. partly so that no jumpy American would gun down one of the most valuable men on the island by mistake. Stop on that for a second. A man carrying a code the entire Japanese empire could not break, nearly killed on his own beach because a fellow American did not think a face like his belonged in the uniform. If you remember one place where this code earned everything, make it Iwo Jima, February 1945, one of the most concentrated killing grounds of the entire war. Marines coming ashore into interlocking fire, almost nowhere to hide, every yard of it paid for in bodies. In the middle of that, the orders that steered the guns, that called the strikes and moved the men, a huge share of it ran through Navajo. Major Howard Connor was the signal officer for the 5th Marine Division. Years later, he said it about as clearly as it can be said. For the first 48 hours, as the Marines landed and clawed out their positions, he had 6 Navajo radio nets working around the clock. In that window alone, he said, those men sent and received over 800 messages, and not one of them contained an error. 800 messages under that fire. Perfect. Connor did not hedge about what it meant. Were it not for the Navajos, he said, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Sit with that sentence, because of whose mouth the words came out of. A Marine officer saying that one of the bloodiest American victories of the war was carried on the backs of men whose language his own government had called a problem to be solved. Iwo Jima was not the exception, it was the pattern. From Guadalcanal in 1942 all the way to Okinawa in 1945, wherever the Marines made a landing in the Pacific, the code talkers went in with them. They waded ashore under the same fire as everyone else, dug the same holes, and then did a second job on top of it, holding a radio and running a secret nobody could crack. They paid for it like everyone else paid. Around 400 Navajos served as code talkers across the Pacific. 13 of them were killed in action. Young men from the high desert who died on islands they had never heard of as children, carrying a secret in their heads to the end. The ones who lived carried the war home with them, the way soldiers always have. Chester Nez came back with the killing still in his head. He could not sleep. The bad dreams would not stop. What healed him was the very thing the schoolroom had tried to beat out of him. His father called for an enemy way, an old Navajo ceremony held for warriors coming back from battle. It runs for days. There is chanting and sand painting and a medicine man, and at the heart of it is one idea, that a man who has been to war and to death can be brought back into balance and back among his people. Nez said afterward that the dreams stopped. Think about that. The language they were punished for, the ceremonies they were told were backward. The whole world the boarding schools had set out to erase. That was what put these men back together when their own war was finally over. But their country was not finished asking things of them. The survivors came home, and they were handed one last order. Tell no one. The code was too valuable to retire. This was the one code the enemy had never cracked, and the military was not about to give that up. So the men were sworn to keep it secret, in case the country needed it again. And it did. The Navajo Code went back to war in Korea a few years later, and reportedly again in the early days of Vietnam. Every one of those years, the code stayed classified, and so did the men. That silence had a price they paid at home. The men who built the code and carried it were bound to keep it. They could not tell their neighbors. They could not tell their children what they had done in the war. A father could sit across the table from his own son for 20 years and never be allowed to explain the one thing he had done that helped decide it. So they went back to the reservation, to the same country that had tried to take their language, and they kept the secret it had asked them to keep. They took ordinary jobs. They herded sheep, they worked, they grew old. And the single most important thing many of them had ever done stayed locked behind a word they were not permitted to say. Some of them died still under that order, the secret still sealed inside them. The single most important thing they ever did, locked shut and uncredited to the end. In 1968, 23 years after the war ended, the code was finally declassified. The silence was lifted. The men were allowed at last to say what they had done. For some families, that was the moment they learned who their father really was. A son who had grown up thinking his dad had done something quiet and ordinary in the war found out that the man across the table had helped hold the radios together at Iwo Jima and had carried it alone for 2 decades because he was told to. Imagine being the wife who slept beside that secret for 23 years and never knew it was there. By then, for a lot of the men, there was almost no one left who had been waiting to hear it. The people they would most have wanted to tell, the parents, the old comrades, were already gone. Recognition came, and it came slowly. It was not until the year 2000 that Congress passed the law. In 2001, the surviving members of the original 29 were brought to Washington, and the President of the United States put the Congressional Gold Medal into their hands. The code talkers who came after the first group received a silver medal of their own. It was the right thing. It was also decades late. Most of the original 29 were already gone. The medals went, in many cases, to graves and to grandchildren, to families accepting an honor on behalf of a man who had died without it. Chester Nez, the boy who was sent to boarding school at 8 and told to be ashamed of his own mouth, lived long enough to see it. He was the last of the original 29 still living. He said near the end of his life that he was proud of what the language had done, this language they had once tried to take from him. He died in 2014, and when he went, the first generation of the code went with him. Here is what I keep coming back to. This country tried to erase a language, and it failed. Then that same language, carried in the mouths of the very men it had tried to silence, turned around and saved thousands of American lives and could not be broken by the most determined enemy on earth. Those men were asked to give their country the thing it had once tried to take from them, and they gave it without bitterness. Then they were asked to say nothing about it for 23 years, and they did that too. We don't have to let it go quiet again. So here is the part I promised. Somewhere in a lot of American families there is a man who came home from that war and never really explained what he did in it. Maybe he sat at a radio. Maybe he worked in signals or intelligence or some job he was told to keep to himself, and he carried that habit of silence all the way to the end. If there is a man like that in your family, leave his name below. Just his name and where he served if you know it. I read every one, and every name we say out loud is one more secret this country does not get to keep. They kept their silence because they were ordered to. We do not owe anyone that silence anymore.